If you've been online anytime in the last 2 years and you've been interested in learning a bit more about Palestine since the start of the genocide, like myself, then I'm sure that you've most likely heard some variation of the following argument.
They came from the surrounding Arab countries that expelled them in massive amounts following the 1948 war. In fact, there was more Jews displaced than Palestinians during the Nakba. 1 million Jews. All of these surrounding Arab countries had vibrant Jewish communities in huge number, hundreds of thousands. Now, if you look at them, you're looking at close to, if not literally, 0 Jews left in these countries.
Just to give you an idea, here's a visual representation of the Jewish refugees after 1948.
900,000 Jews, approximately, 700 to 900,000, were forced to become Zionists, not by choice, but because they were forced out. The vast majority went to the fucking Arabs. The anti-Semitic Arabs.
So, as the argument goes, yes, the Palestinians suffered expulsion, but so did Jews in the Middle East, and in fact, they suffered even more. But how true is this framing of what happened following the establishment of Israel? Well, I'll spoil it for you here. Not true at all. In the following 40 years after the Nakba, the vast majority of Jews from the Middle East left their home countries, but rather than a mass expulsion conducted by Arabs who had all of a sudden become anti-Semitic, the truth is much more complicated, considering the fact that we're talking about various countries, all with their own cultures and situation, and not an Arab hive mind. Ethan Klein makes a big point about being able to read when he pulls one random quote out of a book that he definitely did not actually read by Avi Shlaim, a historian that he thinks backs up his original claim. Let me pull a different quote from the same book that Ethan uses. Zionists are only interested, obsessively interested, in the first phase of Arab-Jewish history. They are profoundly uninterested in the second. Interest in the first phase is driven not by the search for truth, but by the propaganda needed to portray the Jews as victims of endemic Arab persecution, a portrayal that is often used to justify Israel's own atrocious treatment of the Palestinians. This trend reached its climax with the manufacture of the narrative of the Jewish Nakba. According to this narrative, the forced exodus of 850,000 Jews from Arab countries after 1947 amounted to a catastrophe, a Jewish Nakba at least on par with, if not more devastating in its consequences, than the Palestinian Nakba. The purpose of this narrative is to create a false symmetry between the fate of two communities. This narrative is not history, it is the propaganda of the victors. Before I move on to the history, I need to talk about the guy making the claim that we will be responding to in this video. This is Ethan Klein, a comedian turned celebrity gossip commentator and the host of the H3 podcast, a channel that has almost 3 million subscribers at the time of recording this, and probably one of the most well-known entertainment YouTube channels and podcasters on the English-speaking side of the internet. The claim that Ethan Klein made about the double Nakba is part of a year-long period of Ethan repeatedly defending Israel and justifying the genocide in Gaza. Now, I don't want to really waste any time talking about Ethan as a person, but I'll bring up one relevant point that I want to discuss.
Dresden was like a historic city in Germany, said to be one of the most beautiful cities to ever exist. And it was untouched by the war because it was just a civilian city. There was no military there. Right. 2 days after the war ended, the Allies, England specifically, and I think America, they firebombed the whole fucking city just out of straight revenge. And they killed 300,000 civilians.
Now, what I'm going to mention is actually not my own research. That actually comes from this video, which will be linked down below. If you want a far deeper dissection, I'd recommend watching that video. But to very briefly summarize some of the points being made, Ethan Klein is repeating Nazi propaganda. This framing of the bombing of Dresden, from Dresden being the most beautiful city in the world that didn't have any military significance, to the bombing being done purely out of spite, to the number of civilian fatalities, is almost word for word Nazi lies. In the early 2000s, Dresden set up a historical commission made up of various historians to finally answer the question of how many people actually died in the bombing of Dresden. And after a few years of research, came to the conclusion that no more than 25,000 Germans died in the bombing. So how did Ethan come to the idea that the bombings resulted in the deaths of 300,000 people? That claim comes from famous Holocaust denier David Irving's work, The Destruction of Dresden, which itself uncritically cites Tagsbefehl Nummer 47, a daily report issued by the SS. To cut around all the fluff, he is literally repeating the information reported by Nazis to make themselves look like victims. Now, I don't actually think Ethan is literally a Nazi when he repeats these lies, but I do think it shows a lack of critical analysis when it comes to digesting information, and unfortunately, this lack of analysis on Ethan's part, but also I think general understanding of history, can lead to some very problematic places, all of which led to the topic of this video. Neo-Nazis in Germany gather every year on the anniversary of the bombing and march through the city, most of them carrying banners saying something like, "The bombing Holocaust." This is done by various far-right groups around the world to downplay or justify the very real massacres that happened by their hand as something that was either necessary to fight for their survival or as something that wasn't as bad because the other side did it too, as Israelis and Zionists do today. The Nakba was a very specific thing that happened to Palestinians. It was the expulsion of a population on the basis of their ethnicity so that newly arrived immigrants could form a state with a Jewish majority. For the Israeli founding fathers to do this, they had to do two things. First was to expel or kill the people who were living in Palestine, which they considered to be of the wrong race, and second was to convince other Jewish people from around the world to move to Israel. I cover the Nakba and the expulsion of Palestinians in another video on my channel here, but this video will focus on the second part of that problem. How did the early Zionist settlers convince other Jewish people to move to Israel? What we'll come to see is that this, with the exception of Europe, was not the violent ethnic cleansing that Ethan Klein and other Zionists portray it as, but something much darker that reveals a part of Israeli history that these same Zionists like to pretend never happened. When Israel was established in 1948, the European Jews who had formed most of the original settlers were faced with a problem. Now that they had a state, they had to have people make up the citizens of the state. And the people who had been living on the land the state was built on were of the wrong ethnicity, so they couldn't rely on them. For a very long time, Zionists had planned to bring to Israel Jews from Europe. Often ignored by Zionists today, Zionism in the early 20th century was specifically started as a European Jewish colonial project, and early plans for mass migration to Israel focused almost exclusively on European Jews. But then in the late 30s and 40s, the Holocaust happened, and Zionists had to come up with a new plan, and that was to bring the Jews from the Middle East to Israel. Now, David Ben-Gurion and other Zionist leaders were aware of the consequences that would happen trying to make such a massive amount of people move in such a short span of time, and many Zionist writers knew at this point that what they were doing in Palestine would soon begin to affect Jews all around the Middle East. And now, to be clear, it did, but the way that Ben-Gurion and others thought it would happen, a violent and uniform mass expulsion or extermination of Jews like the one which had happened in Europe, was far from reality. Despite this, Zionists today, like Ethan Klein, like to continue pretending that this was the reality. About this, Israeli historian Esther Meir-Glitzenstein writes, "These gloomy forecasts proved false. Although the status and security of the Jews in Arab countries worsened significantly and they suffered political and economic persecution, especially in the tense period of the War of Independence, the Nakba, there were no massacres and there was no danger to Jewish survival. Although the Jews experienced bloody incidents in Cairo, Tripoli, Aden, and Morocco, and although local army and police forces took part in these incidents, overall the attacks were limited in scope and were not the result of a government policy or initiative." Now, to normal people, They might hear that and think, thank God our predictions of a second Holocaust were wrong. But to Zionists, this was a serious problem. If Israel did not have a Jewish majority, then it could not be a Jewish state. Israel did not want to keep Palestinians around, not even for labor. All the homes and the land that they had made empty needed to be worked on and lived in by somebody. Following 1948, Ben-Gurion's 1 million plan became official state policy, a plan to bring 1 million immigrants into Israel in 18 months. But without the expected disaster that Zionists had thought would happen, reasons had to be created for Jews of the Middle East to move to Israel. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to go through almost every single Middle Eastern country one by one and talk about the Jewish exodus from each country individually. Now, for someone to become a migrant, there are usually two factors that would influence the decision: a push factor and a pull factor. I'll get more into the push factors for every country individually, but for the pull factor, I think it's important to identify who exactly was being targeted for migration to Israel. Across all of these countries, one thing remains clear in almost every example, that being that Israel targeted poor Jewish people by offering them land, free homes, and in many cases, literally paying them or someone else per person that moved to Israel. But in many cases, Israel simply positioned itself as a new opportunity, which for families of Jewish people who had been living in poverty in politically and economically unstable countries following independence and the Second World War, that was a big factor in what motivated them to move. Jewish people were parts of these societies in these various countries, which meant that many of them were wealthy and many of them were also desperately poor. And these people, the most vulnerable members of society, almost always came to Israel first. I also want to talk about anti-Semitism in the Middle East before I continue. In Western countries, especially in Germany, ironically, it is becoming more popular to consider anti-Semitism as an Arab import. For thousands of years, Jews lived all over the Middle East, next to Arabs and next to Muslims. I can't speak to ancient history, but Avi Shlaim, an Iraqi Jew who moved to Israel in the 50s, writes in his memoirs that he remembers his family feeling at home in Iraq and spending time and being friends with Arabs and Muslims. I'll bring it up later in the video as well, but even in surrounding countries, there are stories of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syria that would spend time with local Jews, even take part in cultural practices with them. This idea that Israel and Palestine is some deep-rooted ancient conflict between two opposing cultures and religions ignores hundreds and hundreds of years of coexistence between these two groups. The first 5 aliyahs, or Jewish migrations to Palestine, took place before 1948, and some all the way back in the 1880s. Jewish people have always lived in Palestine, next to Arabs and next to Muslims, and this dynamic only changed once it became clear that Zionists were going to start expelling people who weren't Jews. And this isn't to downplay any existing anti-Semitism either. Although the Ottoman Empire was better for Jewish people than the majority of Europe, and in fact European Jews from Spain to the Russian Empire had often fled to the Middle East, once it collapsed, various nations began to form, some of which were more restrictive and oppressive against Jews than others were. But again, this was not a uniform, inherently Arab thing. Up until 1948, Jews had lived side by side with other ethnic groups in various countries for hundreds of years, and just 40 years later, a massive chunk of them had moved to a country to live exclusively with one ethnic group. So what happened? In Iraq, Jewish people were generally speaking fully integrated into Iraqi society and mixed with other groups of people daily. In the early 1940s, there were anti-Semitic laws passed and violence against Jews, but it should be of note that this was carried out under a government which had recently come to power in a military coup with the help of Nazi Germany. What Zionists who like to use this talking point like to leave out is that once the Nazis left Iraq, the new government reversed the laws, and that the vast majority of Jewish people who left during this period moved back to Iraq after, pointing to the conclusion that this was not representative of general Iraqi sentiment, and rather something specific to that government, which was, again, installed via a Nazi-backed military coup. I will be referencing the book Three Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, written by Avi Shlaim, who I referenced in the beginning of this video extensively throughout this part. On top of writing about history, he is also writing about his memories in this book, because Avi Shlaim was one of those Jews who left Iraq in the 50s and moved to Israel. With the exception of the 1941 government and the violence that took place under it, Jews in Iraq lived a relatively normal life. Avi mentions that Iraq had a long-standing tradition of religious tolerance and harmony between different religious and ethnic communities. He describes how he remembers that his parents were close friends with many Arab Muslims and writes, "We in the Jewish community had much more in common, linguistically and culturally, with our Iraqi compatriots than with our European co-religionists. We did not feel any affinity with the Zionist movement, and we experienced no inner impulse to abandon our homeland." Avi writes of his mother, "One day, when she was over 90, I asked her whether we had any Zionist friends. She gave me a look that implied this was an odd question, and then said emphatically, 'No, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It had nothing to do with us.'" This was not just the perspective of Avi Shlaim's family, however, as by the time the vast majority of Jewish people left Iraq, an estimated 1.5% of Iraqi Jews considered themselves to be Zionists. Contrary to the myth of an expulsion, once Israel had been established, the Iraqi government actually banned migration to Israel. In 1950, however, just 1 month after migration to Israel had become legal, a bomb would explode in a Jewish-owned coffee shop. In the following 15 months, 4 more bombs would go off, each targeting the Jewish community. These attacks directly correlated to the increase in migration to Israel, and over the next year, more than 100,000 Jews would leave Iraq. Fearing that a mass migration of this sort would destroy Iraq's economy, the Iraqi government enacted new expatriation laws, making anyone leaving Iraq forfeit their citizenship, as well as not allow transfer of wealth. This was done to protect the already politically unstable Iraq from collapsing under this loss of people and money, but also rendered many Jewish Iraqis stateless and poor. But why was this situation created? Who actually set off these bombs in the first place? One of the bombs still remains technically unconfirmed because of the lack of evidence, but a 2013 book about the Iraqi Jewish community includes a confession from an unnamed member of the Istiqlal Party, an Iraqi nationalist party that was active in the 50s, and Avi Shlaim seems to think this is the most likely culprit for the final bomb, and I'm inclined to believe him. I do want to mention, however, that the Istiqlal Party was not at all very popular and lost all of their electoral seats after the bombing, and then had to disband a few years later. Another one of the bombs was set off by Salih al-Haidari, a Syrian Muslim who had tried to rip off a couple of Jewish businessmen who then reported him to the police. When he was released from custody, al-Haidari went to the men's synagogue and threw a grenade into it, hoping to kill the people that had reported him to the police. The other 3 bombs, however, were set off by none other than a group of Iraqi Zionists who wanted to stir fear in the local Jewish community and make them move to Israel. Yusuf Basri, a young Iraqi Zionist, as well as 2 co-conspirators, had planned the bombings and targeted the local Jewish community. Basri was caught, and with the confession of one of his colleagues, as well as residue from the bombs that were used found in his car, Basri was convicted and put to death. His last words were, "Long live the State of Israel." Nevertheless, during this period of violence against the Jewish community, more than 100,000 Jews left Iraq. But this was not the joyous migration to the long-lost homeland that Israel often depicts it as. Rather, in addition to blaming the Iraqi government, they blamed the Zionist movement for bringing them to Israel for reasons that did not include the best interest of the immigrant. In Syria, Jewish people were strongly equated to Zionism. Under the French occupation of Syria, few Jewish people had already begun migrating to Israel. Once Syria had become independent, however, Jewish migration to Palestine was banned. Violence against Jewish people did rise in the late 40s, but it's important to note that this violence was directly correlated to 2 events: the 1947 partition plan for Palestine and the 1948 Nakba, both of which resulted in tens of thousands of Palestinian refugees arriving in Syria. Then, in 1949, a coup d'etat took place with the help of the CIA. Miles Copeland Jr., who worked for the CIA in overthrowing the Syrian government, wrote in his memoirs that, after trying to influence the 1947 elections one way and failing, they had decided that overthrowing the government was necessary, because they feared that the instability in Syria would lead to the Communist Party of Syria taking control, which they obviously couldn't let happen. So instead, Syria's government would be overthrown, and a military leader more open to Western interests would be installed. This, of course, meant immediately ending all hostilities with Israel and legalizing the migration of Jews to the newly established state. Syria did experience an increase in violence towards Jewish people, but on top of this, it was also a country in which many people lived in poverty and instability, not to mention the fact that it was at war with one of its direct neighbors. So when, after being banned from doing so before and unsure how long the opportunity would last, given the possibility to, many Jewish people made the decision to move either to Lebanon or to Israel. In the following 6 months, the Syrian government would be couped not one more time, but twice more, and instability would continue to persist. The legalization of migration to Israel would change depending on who happened to be in control of the government from year to year, and whenever the opportunity presented itself, more and more Jews would make the decision to move. In the following decades, more and more restrictions would be placed on Jewish people, preventing them from traveling certain distances from their homes, preventing them from owning bank accounts or holding certain jobs, and carefully controlling their migration. Many of Syria's governments did not want its Jewish population to immigrate, though, and migration to Israel would be frequently banned. In Syria, there was a rise of anti-Semitic violence against Jews that equated Judaism to Zionism, and Jews were discriminated against socially and economically as well. And after a series of coups and wars, most Jews made the decision to leave Syria. However, contrary to the Zionist narrative, and despite the very real discrimination and oppression felt by Syrian Jews, there was no organized mass expulsion. In Lebanon, the Jewish community made an effort to distance itself from Zionism. Above all, the Lebanese Jewish community identified themselves, for the most part, as Lebanese nationals. Anti-Semitism was not widespread in Lebanon, and most Jewish people lived a relatively normal and comfortable life. Lebanese Jews during the 30s and 40s have recounted taking part in every sector of life, and that the only anti-Semitism I remember is at the American University of Beirut, a university operated by American Christian missionaries in which all students need to speak English and not their native Arabic. Israel took a special interest in the Jewish Lebanese population because they had correctly assumed that getting them to leave Lebanon would be difficult. Chaim Weizmann, the very first president of Israel, called for special attention to be paid to the Zionist activity in Lebanon, due to the need to instill the Zionist idea within the community. Following the outbreak of the Nakba, Zionism remained unpopular among Lebanese Jews, and many Jews had actually volunteered to fight in the Lebanese military against Israel in 1948. Within Lebanon itself, Jews recounted getting along with the recently arrived Palestinian refugees, and that some Palestinians had even taken part in Jewish cultural practices with them. In fact, some Jews who had made the decision to move to Israel had disliked it so much that they later decided to move back to Lebanon. Other Jews interviewed said, "In the beginning, I wanted to go back to Lebanon. Then my mother came to live with us in 1966. She always regretted leaving. All Jews that left Lebanon remember Lebanon with love." Within Lebanon, the state and organized Lebanese nationalist groups made an active effort to defend the Jewish population from harm. Rioters who targeted Jewish communities were stopped by organized militias, and when Jewish homes were stolen by nationalist groups, the government would send the military to protect Jews. Nevertheless, because of the war between Lebanon and Israel in 1948, some Jewish people did make the choice to leave. Lebanon tried to stop this from happening, however, and the Minister of the Interior, Emilede, spoke with Joseph Atti, a representative of the Jewish community, and begged him to convince Jewish people not to leave the country. In the following years, Jews continued to live among the rest of the Lebanese population, but political instability would continue. In 1967, after the Six-Day War, more Palestinian refugees would arrive in Lebanon. The PFLP, a Palestinian resistance group that was strongly supported by Lebanese Muslims, had begun to attack Israel from Lebanon. In retaliation, Lebanon was continuously bombed by Israel following the war under the guise of combating the PFLP, much like Israel is bombing Gaza right now under the guise of combating Hamas. By 1970, there were more than 240,000 Palestinian refugees, which crippled the economy and caused unemployment and poverty to grow. As the 70s continued, tensions within Lebanon reached a boiling point between Lebanese Muslims who supported the Palestinian cause and Lebanese Christians, some of whom wanted to expel Palestinian refugees. I know that this is a massive oversimplification, but for the sake of the video, this tension eventually led to the Lebanese Civil War, a brutal war which killed over 150,000 people and led to more than 1 million Lebanese people fleeing the country, and among that million were the majority of the Jewish community. Kirsten Schultz, the author of the book I'm referencing for this part, summarizes the exodus of Lebanese Jews as follows. It should be stressed that Lebanese Jews throughout the 20th century unequivocally considered their home to be Lebanon, defined themselves as Lebanese nationals of Jewish origin, and when the political situation in Lebanon disintegrated, they immigrated to places with existing Lebanese expatriate communities such as Paris, New York, Montreal, or Sao Paulo. In the end, the place that the Jews occupied in the history of Lebanon was not that of the enemy within, but as one minority among many. Again, the exodus of the Lebanese Jews runs directly against the Zionist narrative of an Arab mass expulsion. Instead, we get what I think is a really sad history of a population that tried their very best to stay in their home country, despite Zionist attempts to make them move, and over a period of 30 years disappeared because of decades of political instability, war, and poverty, much of which Israel had a direct involvement in. Next, I'm going to talk about Afghanistan. And I know that neither Afghanistan or Iran are Arab countries, and that this is all just indicative of Ethan's and other Zionist Orientalist worldviews, but we'll talk about Orientalism later. To talk about the Afghani Jewish population, we have to talk about Afghanistan's relationship to Nazi Germany. So, since a bit after World War I, Afghanistan looked at Germany as an economic model with which to emulate. In the 30s, there was a complete ban on British civilians who they just gained independence from, and Soviet civilians, who the Afghani elite didn't like very much because of all the communism. Germans, however, were welcomed into Afghanistan and often worked as technical and manufacturing experts. As the war started, Afghanistan collaborated with Germany, manufactured for them, asked German military advisors to come to Kabul, and gave Nazi Germany exclusive deals on Afghanistan's natural resources. And of course, on the German side, they really wanted to keep Afghanistan allied with them because they thought that if they could build up their military in Afghanistan, it would be the perfect place to attack both Soviet Central Asia as well as India, which was still part of the British Empire. As Germany's influence in Afghanistan grew, laws were implemented that financially severely impacted the lives of its Jewish community. Economic restrictions placed on Jews and quotas at workplaces for how many people at a job had to be of a certain ethnic group all impacted the Jewish community and caused many of them to fall into poverty. Around this time, many Jewish people left for India or Iran, which themselves still have a Jewish community to this day. By the end of the Second World War, there were around 5,000 Jews in Afghanistan. Starting in the late 30s and up until 1955, Afghanistan suffered from a famine and virtual economic collapse. There was high unemployment, a 6-time increase in living costs with no changes in wages, and food scarcity. It was at this moment that Israel was created and Zionists came to the Afghani Jewish community presenting themselves as a savior. The Afghani Jewish community reacted very positively to the creation of Israel and saw it as an escape from the poverty, famine, and discrimination that they had been experiencing for the previous decade. The author of the book I'm quoting, Sarah Koplik, mentions throughout that on top of the poverty and discrimination, a lot of Afghani Jews saw Israel as a religious salvation, and that their migration to Israel was a messianic duty. There were also some problematic letters sent from Israel to Afghanistan around this time. Professor Koplik found one in which Israeli Zionists told them that what had happened to Jews in Afghanistan was worse than what had happened to Jews during the Holocaust, and sort of implied that if they didn't come to Israel, it would happen again. Koplik writes later in her book, in spite of the high levels of persecution in the 1930s and 1940s, the Jewish community of Afghanistan was not targeted for extermination. Also, confiscated German documents of the period do not contain a single mention of the Jewish community in Afghanistan. While suffering persecution, these communities survived the war years relatively intact. But due to religious beliefs, discrimination, poverty, and famine, many Afghani Jews wanted to move to Israel, and in 1949, migration to Israel was legalized. By the late 60s, there would be around 300 Jews left in Afghanistan who continued moving out to join the rest of their community over the following decades. So, in Afghanistan, Jewish people were economically discriminated against and suffered from poverty and famine, and because of this, as well as religious factors, many made the choice to leave Afghanistan. But again, there was no organized mass expulsion. Iran was another country whose Jewish population was affected by the Second World War. In the early 20th century, Jews were a minority group within Iran that had a relatively normal life. Forced conversion and other discriminatory practices were outlawed, Jewish people were a part of the government and of everyday life, and Hebrew was used in schools and in newspapers. Zionism was actually relatively well received by parts of the local Jewish population for religious reasons, and the government originally had no problem with it. But once it became more popular, and with the growth of communism in Eastern Europe, the Shah of Iran wanted to fight both communism and Zionism with Iranian nationalism. Then, during the beginning of the Second World War, Iran declared itself to be officially neutral, although they did increase their trade with Germany. Germany tried for a while to get Iran to support them in the war, meeting with Iranian leaders, telling them that Persians were Aryans as well, and even broadcasting Nazi propaganda in Persian, telling Iranians that Hitler was following in the steps of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that when he was done with Europe, he would come to the Middle East to cleanse them of all the Jews and communists. These broadcasts were not very popular, but nevertheless, some Iranians did take this as permission to be violent against Jews and to paint swastikas on shops. In an attempt to remain neutral and not to piss off the British Empire and the Soviet Union, Iran actually distanced itself from Germany as the war went on, telling the German government that Persian Jews were considered fully assimilated Iranians and offering to expel German nationals. And by 1943, after the Soviet Union and Great Britain had invaded them, Iran would declare war on Germany. More than 100,000 refugees from Poland would come to Iran, and because of this immediate massive increase in the population and the use of all the industry and labor to contribute to the war effort, a famine broke out during the 40s, and thousands of people would die. Following a coup in 1953, Iran and Israel had relatively good relations with each other, and the majority of Jewish people continued living in Iran for the following decades. There aren't concrete numbers. Some estimates say that it's less than 10,000 of the 100,000 Iranian Jews that moved to Israel, and some say it's around one-third. But regardless, the majority of Iranian Jews who moved to Israel were those that lived in poverty. Following the instability of the 70s, more protests took place against the Shah until the Islamic Revolution of 1979 eventually overthrew him and installed a new government. This might come as a surprise to people, but the Iranian Jewish community had originally strongly supported this revolution. There was a regular strong Jewish presence at anti-Shah demonstrations. Many Jewish leaders supported the revolution and were actively involved in meeting with revolutionary figures, and Jewish magazines wrote in favor of the revolution. Following the revolution, however, Habib Erganian, the president of the Tehran Jewish Society, was executed on charges of being a spy for Israel, as well as economic imperialism. Erganian himself stated that he was not a Zionist, but that he had worked with Israeli engineers on buildings that he owned, and that he had financial investments in Israel. Many Iranian Jews, especially businessmen and their families, heard this news and began to panic, thinking that any connection to Israel would be enough to warrant an execution. Clarifying the new government's position, Ayatollah Khomeini, the new leader of Iran, issued a fatwa declaring that Iranian Jews should be protected, and Iranian newspapers began with headlines, "We do not believe all Jews are Zionists." Nevertheless, many Jews were frightened by what had just occurred and weren't all that happy with the new government. Unlike the previous government, which had been installed in a military coup led by the US and Britain, this new government was more outwardly hostile towards foreign influence in the Middle East and was more explicitly anti-American and anti-Israel. Also, unlike the previous government, the official state religion was now going to be Shia Islam. That meant that Jewish people, Christians, Sunni Muslims, and other religious groups were protected minorities within the new government. Jewish schools are allowed to close on Sunday rather than the Muslim day off on Friday, and Jews are allowed to practice their religion in public. Nevertheless, under the new government, Jews do face certain restrictions. Although there are Jewish representatives in the government, Jews cannot be in positions of power in government ministries. Jews have to conform to aspects of Sharia that may clash with their religious beliefs, and Jewish people are constantly being scrutinized about their relationship with Israel. As the government of Iran has developed, there have been more people who are stricter Iranian nationalists, which has led to more conflict with the Jewish community. The most obvious example of this would have to be Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a former president of Iran who in 2006 hosted a conference of people to reanalyze the Holocaust. But basically, it was a conference of Holocaust deniers trying to bring new perspectives and interpretations to the Holocaust. This is obviously very disgusting and was condemned internationally, but also by Iran's Jewish community and lots of Iranian youth who were completely opposed to the conference. The protests against Ahmadinejad got so bad that apparently university students even brought homemade bombs to throw at him. All of this goes to show that although Jewish people have some religious rights protected under the new government, forcing them to conform to Sharia, constant questioning and suspicion of involvement with Israel, a very strong anti-Israel policy, and a government that could tolerate having a president that supports Holocaust denial made a lot of Persian Jews feel unsafe. And in the following 20 years after the revolution, many would move to Israel. It should also be noted that on top of this, Israel was offering Iranian Jews $10,000 for each individual who decides to move to Israel, something which was even more effective within this Jewish population because the wealthiest Jews had fled during or immediately after the revolution to avoid being arrested or killed for having connections to Israel. Oman was especially difficult to find information on, not only because its Jewish population was already so small, some estimates go as low as 350 families max, but also because it seems like they all moved out of Oman and that there was practically no Jewish community left by 1900, almost 50 years before Israel was even created. The Jewish Virtual Library, JewishRefugees.org, and Mishpasha, Jewish Family Weekly, each have their own articles on the Jewish community of Oman that all come to the same conclusion, that Oman did not discriminate against Jewish people, and that by 1900 there was virtually no Jewish community left either. In fact, JewishRefugees.org seems to have identified when the last Jewish person left Oman, a man named Suleiman al-Yehudi who left in 1948 after the rest of his family had decided to convert to Islam. So I don't know where the group that made this image came up with the idea that there were thousands of Jewish people in Oman in 1948. Yemen is another country that, upon closer look, does not at all fit the narrative that Zionists like to present. Tom Segev, an Israeli historian, writes about the Yemeni Jewish community. Some of them were desperately poor, subjected to oppression and discrimination, and for them the passage to Israel was liberation. But there were others who lived peacefully and at ease, as farmers, goldsmiths, craftsmen of all kinds, and merchants. There, too, the Jews had to be encouraged to go to Israel. So yes, many Yemeni Jews did make the decision to move to Israel, thinking that it would help them escape poverty and discrimination. But many Yemeni Jews had also decided to stay in Yemen of their own free will. But Israel couldn't allow that. Shlomo Schmidt, the emissary to Adan, wrote to the Yemeni government asking them to expel the remaining Jews from the country, a request that the government refused to do. When this organized form of mass expulsion didn't work, another plan had to be made. About this, Yitzhak Raphael, current head of the Aliyah department of the Jewish Agency, wrote a report in which he claimed that local Arabs had been hired to urge the remaining Jews of Yemen to depart. I will let you infer what kind of urging is implied there. Then, in the 70s, a series of wars broke out between North and South Yemen, who were two separate countries at this point, which caused many Yemenis to flee, and by the end of the war, a very, very small part of the Jewish community remained. In addition to this, hundreds of Yemeni children were kidnapped by the State of Israel to be given to recently arrived European Jews, another example of Israel forcefully displacing a group of people, and another attempt of Israel to forcefully erase the identity and culture of migrants who came from other Middle Eastern countries. Before moving on to the countries of North Africa, I need to explain some things that will be relevant soon. The Universal Israelite Alliance was a French-based Jewish organization founded in the 1800s to impose on the Jewish population of France's colonies, as well as some other Middle Eastern countries. The schools were a part of France's self-described civilizing mission in the Middle East. In these schools, Jewish children would not be taught in their own language, but in French, and the classes would mostly be taught not by local religious leaders, but by European, mostly French, teachers. The impact that this would have on the Jewish population of these countries would separate them from the rest of the local population, because instead of now being a part of the country that is being occupied, speaking the local language and engaging in the local culture, these kids were raised to speak a European language and were educated to think and identify with Europeans, the same people who were currently colonizing and oppressing the rest of the country. It should be of note, though, that in many circumstances, this was not a choice made by Jewish parents to send their kids to these schools. In Algeria, for example, Jewish people were required to attend these schools by law. And once the people of the colonized countries had achieved a level of quote-unquote civilization, many became naturalized French citizens. The Universal Israelite Alliance is just one example that I bring up here, set up by European colonial powers to forcefully change the social dynamics in the country that they were occupying. All of this was done with the intention of separating the Jewish community from the local Muslim communities, either to make part of the indigenous population collaborators to legitimize their claim over the occupied country, or to attempt to raise a part of the population to quote-unquote civilization, which all came to a head when the countries of Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria had to fight to gain their independence from France. In Algeria, for example, during the Algerian War for Independence, the Irgun, a Zionist paramilitary organization, organized Jewish people, most of whom had become French and did not live under colonial military law, into fighting against the Algerians in support of the French occupation. The Algerians did eventually win their independence from France, and following that, French Algerians, including Jewish people, were told that they can stay, be Algerian, and renounce their French citizenship, or they can leave. Unsurprisingly, the vast majority of French people decided to return to France, and among them 90% of the Jewish population, who had for the last 100 years been raised and educated like French people. Tunisia, another French colony, was a similar story to Algeria. Just like the French had done to Algeria, Tunisian Jews were given French citizenship and given a higher place in French-occupied Tunisian society. Then, when the Tunisians got their independence, Habib Bourguiba, a leading figure of the Neo-Nestorians, the leading political party of the newly independent Tunisia, gave a speech announcing, "The Neo-Nestorians are entirely opposed to anti-Semitism and discrimination against Tunisian Jews. They stand for full equality of rights. The Tunisian government and the Neo-Nestorians will do everything to ensure the well-being of Jews, but if some Jews prefer to immigrate to Israel for one reason to another, we will not make any difficulties for them." So, migration to Israel was legalized, and the Jews of Tunisia had the same choice as the Algerians did. Using the same strategy of making Israel appear as a refuge from poverty, many poor Tunisian Jews made the decision to move to Israel, while many upper-class Jews made the decision to move to France. Morocco, again another French colony, was also similar to Algeria and Tunisia. However, of these three countries, Morocco is the only one that could be described as anything resembling a forced expulsion. In many Middle Eastern countries such as Iraq, restrictions or the outright banning of migration to Israel was put in place. Morocco, which was still a French colony at the time, did not have these rules, so many Zionist organizations were able to operate freely to encourage the migration of Jewish people to Israel. Reports from Israel on the Moroccan Jewish population stated that about 60% of the Jewish population needed to be saved from poverty and discrimination. However, 40% of the remaining Jewish population lived a relatively normal life. Under French colonial occupation of Morocco, Zionist groups had struck a deal with French officials to allow them to start the immigration of Jews. First, they targeted the poorest of the Jewish community, promising them that their financial situation would get better in Israel to motivate them to immigrate. It should be of note that not all of these early migrations to Israel were consensual. Tom Segev writes, "The first thing one notices now is the obvious reluctance to go to Israel," wrote one of the Jewish agency emissaries after visiting the transit camp in Marseille. According to him, it had become a widespread attitude. The people virtually have to be taken aboard the ships by force. But once the poorest had migrated, Israel had come up with a plan to get rid of the rest. After the Moroccans had gained independence, King Mohammed V made migration to Israel illegal, forcing the Zionist organizations to work underground to encourage migration to Israel. It remained this way until he would die in 1961 and King Hassan II would take his place. It was around this time that the Egos, a ship full of Moroccan Jews heading to Israel, would sink and everyone on board would die. Israel's current foreign minister, Golda Meir, would come out to publicly accuse Morocco of being at fault for the sinking of the ship and telling the remaining Jews of Morocco that they were in danger. It wasn't until more than 30 years later that Israel would reveal that a series of operational malfunctions caused the sinking of the ship. Now that more Moroccan Jews believed that the new government was trying to kill them and interest in migration to Israel reached a peak, a new deal was struck between Israel and Morocco's new king, with the help of an American Zionist organization and the fascist government of Franco's Spain. Israel now offered to pay Morocco for every Jewish person they allowed to migrate. With the financial incentives for his government and the growing fear in the local Jewish community, the law banning migration to Israel was lifted. Although many of these Jews did move to Israel, it should also be worth noting that, just like in the case of Algeria and Tunisia, many of the Jewish people had been brought up in French schools and had decided to move to France or other European countries as well. None of the three former French colonies conducted a mass Arab expulsion of Jews upon gaining their independence, as many Zionists like to claim. In all three countries, many Jewish people opted to move to France instead of staying in any of the respective North African countries because they were culturally and legally French. And in the case of Morocco, the only forced expulsion of Jews happened at the explicit request, assistance, and facilitation of France and Israel, and had nothing to do with Moroccan Arabs. Egypt is another country that, like the previous three, had a lot of European meddling in it. Egypt did have a pretty big Jewish community in the early 1900s, but a sizable portion of this community were European Jews who were fleeing persecution and had no real connection to Egypt as a country. Then, when Egypt became independent from Britain, Egypt had a strong wave of nationalist, anti-colonial sentiment in its politics. There was a very big part of the population of Egypt called the Mutamasirun, which basically encompassed all foreigners living in Egypt. The Mutamasirun was made up of all groups of people: rich, poor, Italians, Syrians, British, French, Greeks, Christians, and Jews. During the 40s, laws were enacted to ensure that a priority was placed on Egyptians receiving jobs, like setting certain percentages of employees at a factory that had to be Egyptian nationals. This made a lot of the Mutamasirun poorer and unable to find work, and many of the wealthy Mutamasirun with European origins made the decision to move back to Europe. Then, in 1956, Egypt was invaded by Britain, France, and Israel. This, of course, continued the spike of nationalist sentiment, and once the invasion was over, it was blamed on the Mutamasirun. In the late 1950s, Egypt ordered that foreign nationals living in Egypt be expelled, forcing the Mutamasirun population with a foreign citizenship to leave the country. This order did severely impact the Jewish community, considering that about 90% of Egyptian Jews were not Egyptian citizens. However, of that 90%, there was also many Jewish people who were simply stateless. The Egyptian government, having been just recently invaded by Israel and fought with the Palestinians in 1948, was very strongly anti-Zionist. The Egyptian Prime Minister Mahmoud el-Nokrashi Pasha said all Jews are potential Zionists and all Zionists are communists, and he was not the only one who felt this way. In Egypt, Zionism and Judaism were heavily equated to one another, and this led to efforts to expel the stateless Jews from the country as well. Citizenship was revoked from Jewish people on the pretense that they were Zionists, and people were forced to sign papers stating that they were willingly migrating out of Egypt. In Egypt, Jewish people were heavily equated with Zionism and communism, and after the Mutamasirun had been expelled, this led to organized efforts on behalf of the state to target stateless Jewish people, as well as Egyptian nationals, who were seen as part of this foreign group who had been in support of the invasion of Egypt. Similarly to Egypt, Libya was another country that had its Jewish population strongly associated with Zionism. While Libya was under the control of fascist Italy, the Italian occupiers again tried to implement the colonial strategy of Britain and France by dividing the population amongst themselves. This included the forced relocation and separation of Jews from the local Arab communities, although I should mention that while a significant portion was moved, the majority of poorer Jews continued to live like normal around the rest of the population during this time. The Italians took it upon themselves to civilize the Jews and imposed restrictions on Jewish practices, like forcing Jewish people to work on the Sabbath. As the war went on, this attitude towards Jews would change, and eventually the Italian policies of civilization would be changed to the Nazi ones. Jews working in government jobs would be removed, and eventually the Italians began to round up and deport Libyan Jews to concentration camps, much like the Germans were doing in Europe. Despite this, more and more Jewish people became perceived as outsiders to Libyan society and began to be identified as Europeans. Then, after the Italians were defeated, the British, who had supported the creation of Israel since its beginning, were very supportive of Zionism and allowed Zionists to come into Libya to encourage Jewish people to move there. It was around this time that a series of riots would break out targeting the Jewish community and resulting in the death of over 100 Jews. The riot was not a random act of violence, but an organized political attack, evidenced by the fact that the riots began in multiple parts throughout Tripoli at the same time, rioters were given weapons to use, and homes owned by Jews were specifically marked as targets. The author of the book that I'm citing for this part, Jewish Life in Muslim Libya, Rivals and Relatives by historian Henry Goldberg, presents two possible theories for who organized the attack. The one that he believes is that Hizb al-Watani, a recently formed Libyan nationalist party, had coordinated the attacks as a sort of announcement of their political platform by directly striking out against Jews who they considered to be political adversaries and foreigners to Libya. The other theory about who organized the riots is the British government itself, who was still occupying Libya at the time. Allegedly, the reason for British involvement of the planning of the riots was for them to demonstrate on an international stage that Libyans were not fit to govern themselves and that their continued presence in North Africa was necessary to keep the peace. Although the author leans more towards the first theory, he does mention that the British response to stopping the violence was uncharacteristically slow, and that it was generally believed among the Libyan Jewish population that the British, working along with the Jewish Agency for Palestine, had instigated and coordinated the riots. Another piece of evidence that this was a targeted political attack was that this riot was a relatively isolated incident. Besides this specific incident, Jewish and Muslim people continued to live side by side throughout Libya in parts where the Italians had not forcefully separated them. An American consul to Libya wrote in a report that, even with the aggressiveness, or perhaps because of it, both Jewish and Arab leaders inform me that the interracial relations are better now than they have been for several years. In addition, other groups of Libyan nationalists reached out to Jewish leaders asking them to be a part of their cause. Nevertheless, after forced relocation by the Italians and years of British occupation that had allowed Zionists to continue advocating for Zionism, many Libyan Jews became sympathetic towards it. Following the outbreak of the Nakba, many Zionists had traveled to Tripoli in order to organize and travel to the newly established state of Israel to fight on the side of the Israelis. Coincidentally, and I'm sure with no involvement at all from the British government, Tripoli was also decided to be the transit point for North African Arabs who had volunteered to fight for the Egyptian army on the side of the Palestinians. After 2 Arabs were hospitalized by Zionists, another riot occurred, once again targeting Jews in Tripoli. At this point, the political tensions between these two communities had become so strong that by the time migration to Israel had become legal, the vast majority of the Libyan Jewish community chose to move to Israel. In 1967, after the Israeli invasion of Egypt, again violence was directed against Libya's small Jewish community. King Idris urged Jewish people to leave Libya temporarily until after the tensions had settled, and many did. Some returned after the invasion, but many never did. By the time Gaddafi had come to power, there was around 100 Jews living in Libya, and Gaddafi ordered the Libyan government to seize all property left by Jewish people who had moved abroad, as well as cancel all debts. And after that, any Jews who had moved abroad would have found it virtually impossible to move back. Now, in Libya, Jewish people did face anti-Semitic violence, and because of this, many made the choice to move. However, this again is far from the claim that Libyan Jews were forcefully expelled from Libya. After parts of the population had been relocated within their own country, been forced to adopt a more European style of life, after suffering from anti-Semitic violence, and after Zionists were allowed to come into the Jewish community and motivate them to move, many of them did. Libya can and should be criticized for the conditions within its country that motivated many Jews to move out of Libya, and for many Libyan Jews, I'm sure that moving out seemed to be the only choice they had. It would only be a few decades later that in the early 2000s, Muammar Gaddafi announced at a rally that all Libyan Jews who had left would be welcomed back to Libya, compensated for financial losses, and given their old homes back on the condition that they had not moved into a stolen Palestinian home. Now that we've talked for quite a while about the experiences of Jewish people in various Middle Eastern countries, let's summarize and discuss some trends. Israel poses itself as a country that is made for Jews. It uses the most recognizable Jewish symbol on its flag, and uses that same symbol to carve into the bodies of Palestinian hostages, uses that same symbol on the planes and tanks used to invade countries and to bomb cities and villages, and uses it to propagate an ideology and political project that is inherently not just anti-Arab, not just Islamophobic, but anti any group of people that aren't ethnically pure enough to live within its borders. Now, it is anti-Semitic to equate Judaism and Zionism as the same thing, because they're not. But Israel and other Zionists constantly make this equation.
My thing was like, if you don't like 90% of an ethnic group, if you think 90% of an ethnic group are monsters or Nazis or whatever, I think you might just not like that ethnic group. You know what I mean? I don't think that you can. I think that's just racism, frankly, at that point.
Israel has done virtually everything in its power to push this anti-Semitic myth, and for some of the countries we've talked about, they've committed the crime of believing Israel when it says everything it does is for Jews. But even saying that all of the Arabs, as Ethan puts it, equated its local Jewish population to Zionism, and that is what led to expulsion, is such an oversimplification that it becomes wrong. What I hope to have demonstrated in this video is that the Jewish exodus from the Middle East is not nearly the simple story of a joyous return to their homeland or the mass expulsion by the Arab countries, as Zionists like to portray it as. Instead, what do we get? Israel establishes itself as a homeland for Jews by killing and expelling hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. But for Israel to exist, it needs soldiers to defend it. It needs people to believe in Zionism. It needs people to live in its borders. So it begins to invite Jews from all the surrounding countries to move into the houses of stolen Palestinians for free. What we see across almost all the countries we talked about is that in most cases, the first Jewish people who willingly moved to Israel were the ones who were in poverty. Israel also presented itself as a new stable country for Jews to move to, considering that in the late 40s and early 50s, many Middle Eastern countries were suffering economically or from famines due to the Second World War that had just ended, a massive influx of Palestinian refugees having to fight for their independence from Europe and not just build up a new country from scratch, but undo all the harm that the colonialism and occupation had done to them. Many Middle Eastern countries were economically and politically unstable, and so many Jewish people across all of the Middle East chose to move. What happened to the remaining hundreds of thousands of Jews of the Middle East, those that, to quote the Israeli report on Morocco again, lived a relatively normal life, was not the uniformed mass expulsion conducted by the Arabs, but rather various other factors. Jewish people in many countries suffered from targeted violence against them, driven by anti-Semitism or nationalism, or for being European. Some had their property confiscated and were expelled, and many suffered from various economic and social restrictions. But many of them also lived normal lives until they fled civil wars and constant bombardments which Israel was directly involved in. Many of them were paid to move to Israel. Many of them were forcefully taken aboard ships by Israel and removed from their countries of origin against their will. Many of them identified more with European occupiers and fled to Europe when their countries gained independence. Many moved to Israel for religious reasons. Many of them were fleeing bombs planted by Zionists in their community centers, or fled when stories spread by Israel were telling them that their experience was worse than the Holocaust and that if they didn't move, it would happen again. Israel was directly involved in many of the examples we've talked about today, and the narrative that Zionists like to peddle not only quickly falls apart once examined more closely, but also erases the very same Jewish communities and experiences that Israel claims to be fighting for. Avi Shlaim writes in his book, and so do many other Jewish people from these countries, that the experiences of leaving their homeland behind was agonizing and tragic, and that many of these people did not want to leave. The experiences of these people were all different, both before and after 1948, and I think it's very revealing of Israel's character that even the people that it relies on to build its state are all orientalized as the same by the same logic that casts every Arab as a foreign threat. Now that the myth of a double Nakba has been debunked, I can conclude with something much more important. The right of return, the thing that is really the core of the entire problem. What I think is a big problem with some people who believe in a two-state solution, not all of them but some, is that the problem that Palestinians face isn't that they don't have civil rights. It's that they've been ethnically cleansed from their land, and that they are still being ethnically cleansed to this day. If today, for whatever reason, Israel stops the genocide in Gaza and withdraws all the settlements from the West Bank, the core problem of why there are so many Palestinian refugees is not solved. There would still be millions of people who were forced to leave who have to continue living in exile. And it would not be uncalled for or totally out of the blue or inappropriate or terrorism for those people who have been ethnically cleansed to attack the state that had killed their parents for being of the wrong race, even if that state decided to start being very nice to them. As long as Israel exists, the core problem of the ethnic cleansing remains. Israel will never allow the Palestinian right of return because their very existence as a state relies on them being an ethnic supremacist state run by and for Jews, and this whole video up until this point has kind of been how they got all the people from other countries to move there. But if Israel were to allow the right of return, all the Palestinians would move back, and suddenly it would no longer be an ethnic Jewish majority. Instead, it would be a Zionist's worst nightmare. They would have to live next to Arabs who have equal rights to them. Israel, at least in the way it presents itself to the West, is desperate to frame its relation to Palestinians as anything but ethnic cleansing. It will frame it as an ethnic conflict between Arabs and Jews, as a religious conflict between Islam and Judaism, as a cultural conflict between the civilized Western nation and the barbarians in the Middle East. Anything to distract from the core issue that is the right of return. Even the double Nakba myth itself and this whole talking point is not something that Zionists actually believe in. In the 70s and 80s, Israel itself set up the World Organization of Jews from Arab Countries to investigate into the whole mass Arab expulsion myth and to make itself appear as a victim as well, so that anytime Palestinian organizations would talk about the right of return and payment for stolen property, Israel would have something to fall back on. But it was basically all for show. Anytime a Jewish person would claim stolen property, Israel would step in to prevent it from being claimed and eventually shut down the organization because its activity was considered to be ethnic subversion. The state itself cannot have Jews talking about going back to the countries their parents were from or claiming any property, because then that would legitimize the claims of Palestinians. And this is all very clear. In 1975, for example, after the PLO had started talking more about the right of return, the governments of Morocco, Yemen, Libya, Sudan, Iraq, and Egypt offered Jewish people who had left a right of return, an offer that was very quickly rejected by Israel. I want to end this video suggesting that maybe in future conversations with or about Zionists, more time can be spent focusing on why Israel cannot have a right of return for people they have made refugees. If you ask them why there cannot be one democratic state from the river to the sea where both Arabs and Jews can live together, eventually their point will boil down to we need an ethno-state for Jews, and Arabs cannot be a part of that state. And that is a harder position to defend while still trying to appeal to liberal ideals. The state of Israel's very existence requires that non-Jewish inhabitants of the land it exists on are expelled or killed. A Palestinian state from the river to the sea would not only allow millions of refugees to come back home, not only help stabilize the entire Middle East, but also have the ability to be a truly democratic state that is not built on ethnic supremacy. I'll end this video with a clip from Avi Shlaim.
So it's a struggle now between right-wing ethno-nationalism and liberal ethno-nationalism, and I don't approve of either. I think that I believe in democracy. An essential element of democracy is equal rights. I believe in equal rights. I used to support a two-state solution, but Israel has killed the two-state solution with the settlements. So today I support one democratic state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea with equal rights for all its citizens regardless of religion and ethnicity. In other words, I totally reject Israel as a Jewish supremacy state, and I would like it to be a democratic pluralist state. And here, the experience that my family and I had of living together, coexisting with Arabs, gives me reason for hope that what happened once in the Middle East can be can happen again, or at least this is a goal to which I aspire.
Hello everyone, I hope you enjoyed that video. I got the idea to make this video by framing it around Ethan Klein from Noah Samson's latest video, in which he talks about using the algorithm's penchant for promoting videos talking about YouTube drama to trick people into learning about history. So if you were one of those people I tricked, I hope you enjoyed anyway. I hope this video has been educational and that you have a better understanding of the Jewish exodus, so that when people argue the Arabs got all anti-Semitic and kicked everyone out, you have a better understanding of what actually happened. I want to of course suggest everyone reads Avi Shlaim's book 3 Worlds, Memoir of an Arab Jew, because I found it to be incredibly interesting to have the history mixed in with the first-hand account of someone who can place their experiences in a much larger context, but also Kirsten Schultz's The Jews of Lebanon and Harvey Goldberg's Jewish Life in Muslim Libya, Rivals and Relatives. I had to read from quite a few different articles and chapters to make this video, and those 3 books were without a doubt the most interesting to read. I know that Israel and the West in general have a very Orientalist view of the Middle East, and that even to group all Arabs as just being Arabs is kind of a joke. Like an Iraqi Arab, a Yemeni Arab, and an Egyptian Arab all speak Arabic differently. They all have different cultures, history, architecture, food. They all exist in different political situations. And the same was true for the various Jewish communities. Upon arriving in Israel, however, all of these different cultures were deemed to be foreign. People had to stop speaking their own language and learn Hebrew, and had to adapt to a newly forming Israeli culture. And in the process, centuries of experiences and traditions were lost. I wanted to include in the video discussions of how Jews from Middle Eastern countries were forced to shed things that Israel considered to be too Arab in order to fit in better with the white European-centric Israeli culture, but this video was going on long enough. I want to thank all my Patreons for supporting me, who you can see on screen right now. Thank you for any support. It helps out more than you think. If you want to support me, you can find me at Buy Me a Coffee or on Patreon. It would also mean a lot if you can share my videos. I've been told by subscribers that my videos sometimes don't show up in their subscription feed, and that they don't get notified by my uploads. So I guess YouTube is doing its thing, suppressing any content about Palestine. Anyway, the next video will be out sometime in the next month, and we'll be talking about another fun topic, either deportations or Joe Biden.